Thanks so much for being here. This visit, first of all, by Antony Blinken, the first by a top U.S. official to Kyiv since the counteroffensive began. What do you think Secretary Blinken wanted to achieve with this trip?
He basically had three goals for his trip to Kiev. The first goal was to demonstrate the US commitment to Ukraine in the long term. And it is remarkable that many of the financial assurances that Blinken has made really are dedicated to long-term financial planning for Ukraine. He also has underlined that it is not only about the counteroffensive, but that it is also about Ukrainian democracy and about Ukrainian economy, Ukraine's economy, so taking the long-term view. The other point that he wanted to make with this visit is to counter the perception that the Ukrainian counteroffensive is stalled, that Western policy has ended in an impasse, that there's no movement on the front, the kind of dissatisfaction that we've seen in recent weeks as the counteroffensive has not progressed as fast as possible. And lastly and thirdly, he also wants to have a look himself at what is going on in Kiev, what the Ukrainian plans are for the counteroffensive in the future, especially as there have been a lot of anonymous sources from the US government who have talked about disappointments when it comes to the counteroffensive and have also criticized anonymously in newspaper reports Ukraine for mistakes in their strategy. And that's something that Secretary Blinken wants to counter. He wants to get a picture on site of where the counteroffensive stands and what to do next.
It's interesting that you mentioned that Antony Blinken wants to get a first-hand view, I guess, so to speak, of how this counteroffensive is progressing. What do you think he's hoping to see, and what kind of results would make it easier, potentially, for the aid and for the money to continue to flow from allies like the U.S.?
Obviously, it would be very easy if Ukraine would be able to show these kind of rapid advances that it has demonstrated last year. But the situation is just very different from last year. Russia has been able to fortify the territories that it occupies, especially with mines. So there's equipment, demining equipment lacking. There's also continuous ammunition problems for Ukraine. And so what Antony Blinken certainly wants to see is a plan how Ukraine hopes to advance until the end of the year, and more specifically until the winter season sets in, when it will be more difficult with frozen grounds to advance. So there is a window of opportunity left for Ukraine, weeks, if not a few months before winter sets in. And Antony Blinken certainly wants to know how they're going to use this time and what else Western allies can do to support Ukraine in this short window of time that is still left.
Looking ahead now to the G20 meetings coming up in India this weekend, presumably the war in Ukraine will be on the agenda with all those world leaders there. How crucial do you think that gathering will be to shore up support as this conflict continues into the coming months?
Yes, it will be on the agenda, but it will also be something like the elephant in the room, the topic that is basically spoiling all other topics discussed at the G20, because the biggest problem that we see is that the Ukraine issue, Russia's war against Ukraine, has become such a divisive issue within the G20. It has become increasingly difficult to get a joint leaders declaration, which India, which is having the G20 presidency, has tried to achieve in the past or work towards in the past on ministerial level. Russia and China are not becoming more conciliatory when it comes to language about Ukraine, to the contrary. So Ukraine has really become the dividing issue among the G20. And it can also be the case that the G20 summit will end without a leaders' declaration or only partial declaration or commitments, which will also impact all other topics, climate change, debt relief, that are usually discussed within these forums. So we see in the G20 a bifurcation, sort of two sides emerging, the pro-Ukrainian and the more hesitant side. And those camps are led by the West on the one hand, and on the other side, especially by China.
Antony Blinken was in Ukraine. He'll be on his way to that G20. President Biden on his way soon as well. Liana, Fellow for Europe at the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you so much.
Thank you.